what I'm getting paid for. So that being said, let's jump on in here into chapter 5. All right, you will be having your first tests coming up here soon, and so I want to get into the last chapter of your first lecture exam. Okay, so that is going to include tissues. All right, so if you haven't had a chance to watch the earlier videos on chapter 4 on cytology, I recommend that you do so. I completed the second part of chapter 4 today, and I would have had it out to you folks on Saturday. Unfortunately, I did something foolish and I didn't turn the audio on, and so I can assure you that the audio is obviously on because you can hear me now. So let's talk about a couple things here. All right, so first of all, as we move through the organizational spectrum here, our course, we are now moving up another level. We've went from molecules, atoms and molecules, up to cells, and now we're moving up to the next level, which is tissues. All right, so again, we're moving up in complexity, all right, as we transition from cells to tissues. And so a great test question that I have asked on some of my tests includes, what are tissues? And they are grouping of similar, you want to make sure you note that they are similar cells, all right, and the extracellular material, because as you know, when we're dealing with cells, there are tissues, there's 3 components: the actual cells, the ground substance, and the protein fibers. Well, the protein fibers and the ground substance make up the extracellular material. But all of these structures will come together to perform a common function. It could be secretion, it could be absorption, and the example that we cite here, it's protection. All right, but they have a common function involved. All right, so you need to note that, because when we move into the next level, which are organs, which we'll talk about briefly at the end of this chapter here. All right, that can be several groups of cells that aren't necessarily the same, and they'll have various functions. When we're talking about tissues, there are similar cells that perform a common function. All right. So as you know, histology is the study of tissue. Cytology is the study of cells. This statement here, you need to know, not only for this class, but it's very important that you know it for 211. Okay. You will be asked this many, many times. So this should be something when we talk about the 4 types of tissue, you should be able to rattle this off, all right, quickly, easily, and with no effort whatsoever. Epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. We're going to go through some, all right, I'm not going to go through each specific type of epithelial and connective tissue. You should have already done this. This is a review session, okay? So we'll go through some, but we're not going to go through all, okay? So when we break down epithelium, we're going to talk about some of the characteristics of epithelial tissue. All right, so you can refer to it as epithelium, or you can also refer to it as epithelial tissue. Okay, but one of the things that you need to know is, and if you've already probably checked this out when you've gone over this material in the soft chalk lessons, is that epithelial tissue is classified partially by the number of layers that are involved. If it's simple, it's 1 layer. If it's stratified, it's 2 or more layers. So it's going to be, when we talk about epithelial tissue, 1 or more layers. But this is an important characteristic, that these cells are closely packed to one another. Not like connective tissue, all right? Some of those cells can be spread out pretty far from one another. But when we're talking about epithelial tissue, this is a characteristic you need to know, is that they're closely packed to one another. So they virtually contain almost no or very little extracellular matrix. So what is extracellular matrix? That means ground substance, protein fibers. Okay? So where we find some of this epithelial tissue is we're going to find it on top of body surfaces. Perfect example of that is going to be the skin. Okay? The outer layer, the epidermis of our skin, is again epithelial tissue. Okay. We'll also see it lining body cavities. Well, where did we see that? You talk a little bit about it in lab, all right? When we talk about there's 4 different types of membranes in your body, all right? 2 of them we'll address in this semester, and then the other 2 you'll address in Bio 211. But the first membrane that we talked about was a serous membrane. And the serous membrane is that membrane that lines the body cavities. It's made up of 2 layers. One layer that lines directly over the organs, all right, that's called the visceral serous membrane. And then the other layer is going to line the inner lining of, or the inner portion of the body cavity, and that's the parietal, all right, serous membrane. Okay, but this type of membrane lines body cavities. The second type of membrane that we'll discuss this semester is the cutaneous membrane, and that'll be in the next chapter, in chapter 6. That's the skin. Okay, you also have a mucous membrane and synovial membrane. All right, we'll address the synovial membrane in chapter 9, and then the mucous membrane we touch on in 211. Okay. So epithelial tissue is also going to make up the majority of our glands. All right, we'll get to glands in a little bit here. All right, but one of the major characteristics, and it's very important that you know this, is that epithelial tissue is avascular. All right, there is no blood vessels that are going to be found, in this type of tissue. Okay, so I know we haven't really covered it in lecture, but in lab, when you're going over some of the material, especially in the epidermis there, you will look through the epidermis and you won't find any capillaries, veins, arteries. None of that will be found in the epidermis, which is epithelial tissue. So that's an important characteristic of epithelial tissue that you need to be made aware of, is that it's avascular. Okay, no blood supply will be found there. So some of the situation, or when we're just dealing with the characteristics of epithelial tissue, all right, is this next characteristic, which is cellularity. Okay, and cellularity has to do with the fact, all right, that this characteristic is made up of, the epithelial tissue is entirely made up of pretty much cells, but they're tightly packed cells, which means we have very little to no extracellular matrix. So we refer to that characteristic as cellularity. All right. The next characteristic is polarity. So what does that mean? Well, just like the Earth has a North Pole and South Pole, okay, your cells have a top portion and a bottom portion, or what we refer to as an apical surface and a basilar or basal surface. So I'll draw a quick picture here, and I'll use the columnar cell. All right, so here's a traditional columnar cell. All right, so this top portion here of the columnar cell is referred to as the apical surface, all right, or region, and the bottom portion of the columnar cell is referred to as the basilar surface or the basilar region. Okay, so if we're dealing with stratified epithelium, okay, in which there's multiple layers, the top layer is going to be known as the apical layer, or the apical surface of the epithelial tissue, and the bottommost layer will be referred to as the basilar or basal surface. All right, so keep that in mind. Now, we also do have, when we're dealing with, all right, the epithelial tissue, we'll have the lateral portions of these cells. All right, and so when we're dealing with the lateral portions, we're dealing with these structures here, the intracellular junctions. And these are the structures, if you remember from chapter 4, when we were talking about the cell-to-cell adhesions, all right, that's what certain proteins will, their function is to actually attach cells to one another, okay? They form these intercellular junctions. And these are these portions of the cellular membrane, the plasma membrane, in which they attach. Well, I should be drawing these over here. All right, where the cells, when they're connecting to one another, they're attaching themselves to one another and forming these tight adhesions, all right, that hold these cells close together. And that's a significant characteristic because it prevents things from entering down in between the cells, all right? Like viruses, for example. When you get a runny nose, a lot of that, because you have the common cold, let's say, the common adenovirus, or even a rhinovirus, or even coronavirus. And I'm not talking about COVID-19, but the coronavirus is also a classification of family viruses that have to do with the common cold. All right. So what those viruses do is they help to disrupt those intracellular junctions, and they try to penetrate in between the cells. So it's crucial that these cells are able to maintain those intracellular junctions, because we don't want viruses getting in between, all right, those surfaces, the lateral surface of cells, because if they start to penetrate deep down inside, then that virus infection can become much more significant. Okay, so this is what we're looking at here for those certain characteristics here. This top portion is going to be the apical surface. The bottom portion down here is the basilar surface. And then our lateral surfaces, where we find those intercellular junctions, are going to be found in between these cells. Epithelium sits on top of the basement membrane. Okay, that's that tissue that forms a selective barrier in between the epithelium and the connective tissue that lays below it. All right, so we'll talk about the connective tissue here in a moment. All right, a couple of the functions for epithelial tissue include physical protection. All right, stratified epithelium, all right, especially if it's keratinized, like in the outer layers of our skin, is going to serve a protective function. So like our skin, it helps to prevent dehydration, the loss of excess water. All right, the bottom of your foot is many, many cell layers thick. It's thick skin, thick skin, thick epithelium. So it helps to protect against abrasion. Okay, as you start to have skin slough off, if you walk barefoot around several areas here, all right, that thick skin helps to protect the sole of your foot there. All right, when we talk about the gatekeeper function or the selective permeability, all right, this function helps us to understand that some substances will be allowed to pass across the epithelial tissue, while others will not be. All right, and we see that, all right, when we're discussing skin, for example. All right, our skin is waterproof, but not, is water resistant, but not waterproof. So water is kept out for the most part, but sometimes it's able to slip in. Simple epithelium will allow the movement, all right, for example, in the alveoli, okay, it allows for the movement of respiratory gases to cross, all right, the epithelium, but blood cells, like the red blood cell, the erythrocyte, does not cross over, okay, because it prevents the passage of the movement of red blood cells, but it does not prevent the passage of the respiratory gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, okay? When we get into the glands, both exocrine and endocrine glands, we'll see that those glands will have secretions, like your sweat glands. Your sweat glands produce sweat, and depending on which type of gland, all right, it will produce different types of secretions. Some secretions will be more water-based. Others will be less water-based, but will involve more like electrolytes or other types of substances, okay? And then finally here we see sensations. We've got that neuroepithelium, which is a special type of epithelium that will supply sensory information to the nervous system, usually touch and pain, all right, especially light touch, okay, vibration. Pain is a very, very important sensation that needs to be provided to the nervous system because it helps us to actually protect ourselves from certain types of deadly stimuli, for example. All right, I'm just going to quickly review here how we label the types of epithelium here. All right, it's very important that you know how to label the epithelium. The first part of classification for epithelium is due to the number of cell layers. So real simple. If you have one cell layer, then it's referred to as simple. The functions of simple epithelium primarily revolve around filtration and absorption. Okay? Secretion is also included there, but it's mainly filtration and absorption. It's always easier to filter or absorb something across one single cell layer than it would be to pull something across 30 cell layers. All right? The second part of classification for epithelial tissue is based on 2 or more cell layers, and that is going to be stratified. Okay? So with stratified epithelium, the only layer that makes contact with the basement membrane is going to be the basilar layer. But one of the important concepts that you need to understand about stratified epithelium, when we're naming stratified epithelium, we always look at the apical layer and we see what the apical layer, that's the topmost layer, we look at that and see what it looks like. Okay? And that's how we'll classify the epithelium. Because when we get into chapter 6, you'll see that when we're talking about the epidermis, there's several layers to the epidermis, but the bottommost layer, which is referred to as the stratum basale, all right, those cells appear to be what we call cuboidal or low columnar. But when the cells migrate from that layer to the superficial or the topmost layer, which is called the stratum corneum, those cells appear to be squamous. So we'll refer to that epithelium as stratified squamous. All right, so just keep in mind, when we're dealing with stratified epithelium, we look at the topmost layer or the apical layer, we see what the cells look like, and if there's a squamous appearance, then we call them stratified squamous. If they're cuboidal in appearance, then we call it stratified cuboidal. So it's always the appearance of the apical layer, okay, not the basilar layer. So when you have many layers of epithelium, okay, their main purpose and function is going to be for mechanical stress support, mainly protection. Okay? And then the third type of classification for epithelial tissue is pseudo-stratified epithelium. So pseudo being false, so it's falsely stratified. So it appears to be layered, but it's not. But here's the thing. Every single cell in that pseudo-stratified epithelium, every single one is going to connect, all right, or contact that basement membrane. But not all of them are going to make it to the apical surface. And that's why it appears to be stratified. Because you'll look in some of the cells and their nuclei happen to be at different levels. And so at first glance, when you're looking at it, like, oh, okay, that all looks to be stratified, but it's not. Because every single one of those cells are in contact with the basement membrane, but not all of them make it to the apical surface. The second part of classification of epithelial tissue is having to do with the shape, all right, of the cell. All right. So the first one is the squamous cell, and it can be described as a fried egg or floor tiles. So the squamous cell is a flat, irregular shaped cell, and it usually what will happen is the nucleus of a given cell will mimic the shape of the general cell structure. So since a squamous cell is flat and irregular shape, the nucleus will appear to be flat. Cuboidal, okay, those cells, all right, will be as tall as they are wide. They'll look like a square, okay? And so the nucleus will be directly in the center, and that will be spheroidal in shape. Columnar cells are like a column, so they'll be taller than they are wide, and the nucleus will also mimic that shape, and it will appear to be oval. But usually the nucleus is in the what we refer to as the basilar region, or the bottom half of the cell. And then finally, the last cell that we are going to talk about are the transitional cells. Those are the transformer cells. They like to change shape like the robots in the movies. It depends on what's going on in epithelial tissue. We find this type of tissue, the transitional cells, to be in the urinary bladder or the urinary tract. So when your bladder is full, those cells are stretched out because they're getting pressed upon. When your bladder is empty, they're relaxed. Okay, so they're going to look somewhat elongated. Not elongated, excuse me, we call it diagonal. So they'll look like this. All right, but when your bladder's full, they'll be stretched out and flat, kind of like that. So they transform. So this slide here will show you, all right, one, on the left half of this slide, we see how we name the epithelium for the number of layers. So if it's one layer, it's simple. If it's two or more layers, it's stratified. And you can see here, these cells here at the bottom look much different than the cells on the top layer. So we don't name stratified epithelium for the bottom layer, we name it for the top layer. When it comes to the shape or the thick, when it comes to the cell shape. The three cell shapes that we're talking about, the first one is squamous cell, that's a flattened cell. The next one is the cuboidal cell, that's going to be, the cell will be as tall as it is wide, and the nucleus will be right in the middle, spheroidal. And then we've got our columnar cell. And then the nucleus will be down towards the bottom half of the cell. It looks like an egg, okay? Oval. Questions so far? I'm going to just pause here for a moment. If there's any questions, throw them out at me. If I'm moving too fast, I'll slow down. Okay, that's cool. That makes me think that I'm doing an okay job in explaining this to you folks. Okay. Because again, this is a review. So I'm assuming that you folks should already have been exposed to this material. Cool. So have you folks, I'm going to take a break here for a moment. Have you folks been finding that the videos, the review videos that I've been putting online, have you been finding that those have been helpful? Thank you, April. I hope it's helpful. Okay, good. All right. That's something that I have done. This is my second semester teaching an online class. So last semester in the summer, oh good, thank you. I want them to be very helpful for you. Again, they're not designed to teach you the material, they're designed to help you review the material. I started teaching the online portion of biology 210 and 211 this past summer. So I decided every couple of days I would release a video and just touch on some material. So I just want to make sure, again, in addition, I want to give you plenty of resources, and I think we provide you folks with several resources for this class, but I want to provide you with additional resources. And the videos are meant to be like that for you. All right, so let's move on to this figure here, figure 5.3. All right, now you're going to probably get tired of me saying this, but when you see this type of figure, this diagram, what I tell folks is go into the diagram and memorize everything here. It might seem like a lot, it might not seem like a lot, but if you start here and memorize this, then you can move into the more detailed aspects. I am not going to get into each of these tissues here, all right? That's what the soft chalk lessons are for. Okay, I'm not going to review each and every single one of these tissues. Okay, but I would say start with that. Give yourself an idea. There's some nice charts in your textbook in chapter 5 that break down, all right, some of the functions of these tissues and the description of these tissues. So learn those. Start with the when I say with the easy stuff, start with this right here. This is the excuse me. This is the minimal beginning or basics of epithelium. So I would start with that, gain your knowledge from this, and then you can move into the more detailed aspects. So when we're dealing with epithelium, one of the simple rules that I tell folks when you're talking about simple epithelium, one cell layer thick, all right, going to be seen in tissues that are meant for absorption, secretion, or diffusion. Stratified, many layers, is best for physical protection. Simple rule, commit it to memory, okay? It'll be very helpful if you do that. Okay? Now we're going to switch gears here, staying with epithelial tissue, but we're going to talk about glands. All right? So let's first talk about what a gland is. Okay? Now glands can range from an individual cell, like we saw with the goblet cell, or to a multicellular organ that's going to be composed or made up of that epithelial tissue. And so they're going to secrete things. The goblet cell we saw secreted mucin. When mixed with water becomes mucus. But some of these multicellular glands will secrete things like hormones, like the thyroid gland, for example, or the adrenal glands. All right, enzymes or electrolytes. All right, so keep that in mind. Glands are going to secrete things. All right, so there's two types of glands. There's the endocrine glands, which you're going to get into detail in chapter 17, and that's in biology 211. All right, and exocrine glands. Okay, so you need to know the difference between the two. All right, an exocrine gland is a gland that has a duct, D-U-C-T, a duct. Okay, endocrine glands do not have ducts. All right, so like noted down here, exocrine glands lack ducts. So basically, when they're secreting things like hormones, they're going to secrete the hormones directly into the fluid outside of the cells. That's the interstitial fluid, all right? Or directly into the blood. So they don't have ducts. Like the sweat glands in your skin, they have ducts, all right? So they're going to secrete your sweat onto the surface of your skin, for example. Endocrine glands do not, okay? So exocrine glands. All right, essentially what we're seeing is, and I have no idea where that came from, all right, but exocrine glands, all right, are going to be made up of epithelial tissue, all right, that have invaginated themselves or just kind of sunken down into different types of tissue, all right, in connective tissue. But they have a duct. So the gland itself will secrete some sort of secretion and then push it out into the duct, and then that duct will then secrete it out into the surface of wherever that gland is found, right? Like the sweat glands in your skin, all right? Or the mammary glands found in breasts, or in your mouth, the salivary glands, okay? So these glands are lined with epithelium, all right, and they're going to generate and create a secretion, and then they'll move that secretion, all right, through a duct out into the surface of something, or if we're talking about your mouth, all right, for salivary glands, they'll move those secretions into your mouth, for example, okay? So there's three types of glands that we're going to talk about, all right, when we're dealing with the exocrine glands. All right, you have a merocrine gland, an apocrine gland, and a holocrine gland. These two, merocrine and apocrine, you saw when you were doing your lab identifications. You did also see a holocrine gland, all right, but we called it something different. We called it a sebaceous gland, okay? So you saw all three of them. We just didn't call the holocrine gland a holocrine gland. We called it a sebaceous gland. So let's discuss the three types of glands. The merocrine gland here, all right, these are going to be the ones in which the gland, and I'll show you pictures to help you to kind of understand. But whatever their secretion they're making, they're going to package it up. And if you've seen my part 2 of chapter 4 lecture video here, all right, I discussed what a vesicle was. And a vesicle is like a bubble or membranous sac envelope that these cells will actually create, all right, and they'll put some sort of substance inside of those vesicles, and then it sends the vesicle to the plasma membrane, and then through the process of exocytosis, it emits whatever that secretion is outside of the cell. Right? That's what American glands do. They package up, all right, their secretions into these vesicles, and they release their secretions through the process of exocytosis outside of the plasma membrane. So you can see tears that are formed in your eyes are processed by American glands. All right, saliva from your mouth, same thing. Some of the sweat glands that your body has, those are all through American gland secretions. The next type of gland is called an apocrine gland. All right, now for those of you, and I put this here, I want you to think of a lava lamp. Now that's going to be kind of specific to some older folks, because lava lamps aren't as popular nowadays as they were when I was growing up. But if you've ever seen a lava lamp, it has this material on the inside, and it looks like I don't know how to describe it, but it's the substance, and it just kind of pinches off and bubbles away, all right, and it's lit, all right, because there's a lamp underneath. Well, with apocrine glands, the cell operates in a similar function. The top portion of the cell, or the apical membrane of the cell, will literally pinch off, okay? And when it pinches off, it becomes the secretion. It becomes the secretion. So these types of secretions are going to be a little bit thicker, a little bit or more viscous, okay? So we'll see these types of secretions in the mammary glands and in the ceruminous glands. And where are those found? In your earwax, all right? The last type of gland, the holocrine gland, I think of Holocaust, all right? If we were to witness a nuclear holocaust, it would be complete destruction of the world through nuclear war. All right, a holocaust requires destruction of something. So these types of glands, the actual whole cell will rupture, destroy itself. All right, but the whole cell becomes the actual secretion. So when we're dealing with that situation, that type of secretion is even more thick or more viscous, all right? And that's what we see with sebum or the sebaceous glands, the oil that is secreted onto your hair, all right, or onto the peach fuzz of your face. That is a sebaceous gland secretion. So those are holocrine glands. So moving over here to this diagram, you can see the three different types of glands: merocrine, apocrine, holocrine. So with the merocrine, the gland itself, or the cell itself, makes a vesicle, and then that vesicle carries the contents of the secretion. They move towards the apical surface, they release that secretion into the duct, and it travels out of the gland. All right, and then through the duct and out onto the surface here. We see that with the salivary glands. Some of your sweat glands do the same thing. All right, when we talk about the apocrine gland, the top portion of the cell actually will pinch off. Okay, and you can see these bubbles kind of forming off the tops of these cells here. All right, so the top portion of the cell pinches off. All right, and so whatever is inside that bubble, including the cell contents, then becomes the secretion. And we see that in structures like the mammary glands and then the ceruminous glands in the earwax. The final type of cell is a holocrine gland. All right, so the actual whole cell itself will self-destruct, and then the cell and all of its contents will become the actual secretion. And so they get emitted out through the duct and onto the surface of whatever. And we see that with the sebaceous glands that are associated with hair follicles. Okay? It's important that you know those. You'll, when we get into chapter 6, we'll review a couple of them. Okay? All right, so let's move on to the next type of tissue. Just finished the epithelial tissue. Now we're going to move into the second type of tissue, which is connective tissue. Okay? So I've seen this asked before on tests. So one of the characteristics of connective tissue, you want to know it's the most diverse and abundant type of tissue in our body. It's all over the place. So it's widely distributed throughout our body. Okay? Very diverse, it's very abundant, and it's widely distributed throughout our body. And of course, it forms, all right, it has, well, it doesn't form, but it has several functions. Support, all right, also protection, helps to bind organs. When we talk about the different types of connective tissue, all right, you got connective tissue proper, then you've got supporting connective tissue and fluid connective tissue. All right, so they have many different functions. Like fluid connective tissue helps to, transport materials throughout your body. It's one of its functions. All right, supporting connective tissue, which is bone and cartilage, literally helps to support your body. Also, it adds to protection because bones help to protect organs. So connective tissue has a wide variety of functions. All right, so you can see all the different types of examples here. Tendons and ligaments. All right, that's dense connective tissue. Adipose, that's a loose type of connective tissue. Cartilage and bone is the supporting connective tissue. And then one of our fluid connective tissues is blood. But all of this connective tissue comes from this tissue here called mesenchyme. And that's an embryonic connective tissue, which means, think of mesenchyme as like a stem cell. And if you're familiar with stem cells differentiate, or they can turn into different types of tissue. Okay, that's why there's such a big deal or a lot of research going into stem cell research right now, because we've learned that stem cells can be added to certain areas to help maybe repair tissue or regenerate tissue. Okay, but for connective tissue, all right, the stem cell, all right, type of tissue we refer to as mesenchyme. And you're going to see this again later on in later chapters. Okay? All right. One of the popular characteristics about connective tissue is its vascularity. And what that means is how much blood vessels can be found in this tissue. And it ranges from a lot to very little. Okay? So our loose connective tissue will have a large amount of vascularity. So they'll be very vascular. Because if you have loose connective tissue, that means you have a lot of ground substance. You have a few cells and some protein or fibers, all right? But if you have a lot of ground substance, that means you have a lot of space and blood vessels can grow in there, okay? But if you have a dense connective tissue, all right, then you're not going to have as much blood vessel presence, all right, as you would with loose connective tissue. Because in dense connective tissue, you have less ground substance, okay? So blood vessels can't grow in that space. And then in other types of tissues, we have no blood vessels present. And we refer to that as avascular, like mature cartilage. Immature cartilage, there's a little bit of blood vessels. But in mature cartilage, they have no blood vessels present. So it's avascular. So the vascularity ranges, all right, in connective tissue. And that's an important function or characteristic, that you should know. Okay? Because as epithelial tissue, it was avascular all around. But with connective tissue, it varies in its vascularity depending on what type of connective tissue you're dealing with. So if you look here at the functions of connective tissue, all right, there's quite a bit. All right. So physical protection, you can see, well, an example of that would be bone, even cartilage, because cartilage is part of your rib cage there. All right. Support and structural framework, certain types of connective tissue, all right, like reticular fibers there. You will see dense irregular connective tissue, it helps to support but actually creates a structural framework, like in spongy bone, for example. All right, you'll see, all right, that structural framework in existence. All right, storage is great for adipose tissue. Adipose tissue stores lipids, and lipids are energy. All right, your bones also have a function of storage because they store phosphorus and calcium in the form of what we call hydroxyapatite, bone salts. Okay, transport, you heard me mention that about the fluid connective tissue. Things get moved around through your blood system and your lymphatic system. And then immune protection, same thing. Okay, connective tissue that's found in your dermis of your skin, but also your white blood cells, which are part of your fluid connective tissue. So you can see all these functions of connective tissue are pretty diverse. Okay, so again, we got another chart here, or diagram. Okay, so I would start off, all right, and I teach this to my other sections as well, so you folks are no different. All right, when we're talking about connective tissue classification, we see that, all right, when we start to break down connective tissue, we break it down into 3 different types: connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, and then fluid connective tissue. And then when we get into connective tissue proper, we break it down into loose and dense connective tissue. And there's 3 types of each. All right, when we're talking about loose, we get the areolar, the adipose, and the reticular. Dense connective tissue, we've got dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. And then we get here to the supporting connective tissue, we've got cartilage and bone. All right, and there's 3 types of cartilage: hyaline, fibrocartilage, and elastic. And then for bone, we've got compact and spongy. And then finally, we move into the fluid connective tissue, we've got blood and lymph. So start with this chart, learn it, okay, so you understand the breakdown, excuse me, of connective tissue here. All right, on to the 3rd type of tissue. All right, and that's muscle tissue. Now we're going to start to get into when I say the easier stuff, epithelium and connective tissue, since there's a lot of material there, can be a little bit more complicated. But now we're moving into, all right, some of the easier material. Muscle and nervous tissue are the last 2 types of tissue in the body. When we talk about muscle, I want you to think of muscle movement, okay? So muscle tissue is going to move something. So when those cells are stimulated, all right, through some sort of stimulus, be it chemical or electrical, mainly through nervous function, okay, you're going to see movement on some scale. All right, so if we're dealing with skeletal muscle tissue, then we'll see voluntary movement of body parts. All right, when the heart is beating, all right, that is also movement through cardiac muscle tissue. When we move food through our small and large intestines, that is going to be, all right, smooth muscle. So there's 3 types: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. All right, skeletal is a voluntary type of muscle tissue. So if you're typing on your computer or you're writing down notes, that is because you're utilizing skeletal muscle tissue. Cardiac and smooth, those are non-voluntary. You don't have any control over those, okay? And finally, the last type of tissue in our body is going to be nervous tissue. And there's 3 places that you'll find this type of tissue: in the brain, spinal cord, and the nerves. The brain and spinal cord makes up the central nervous system, CNS. And then the nerves make up what we call the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS, okay? We'll get into that more, all right, in later chapters. Chapter 13, 14, 15, okay? So the 2 types of cells that we'll focus on with nervous tissue are, the first one are the neurons, and that's the superstar of nervous tissue, okay? Those are the cells that are going to receive, transmit, and they're going to process that nervous information they receive. Okay, so if you want to actually be able to take notes, the neurons are going to transmit that information from your brain out to the skeletal muscle tissue. All right, but the neuron is the diva of the nervous system, and just like every diva, there's going to be an entourage. And the entourage for the neuron are the glial cells. They're the support cells. And actually, there's more glial cells in your body than there are neurons. And they do not transmit nerve impulses. The neurons do that. But what they do is they help to protect, they help to provide nourishment to the neurons, and they'll support the neurons. And in some cases, if a neuron dies, all right, and starts to degenerate, they'll fill in the space where the neuron once lived with scar tissue. Okay? So they're like the gopher. Think of them as the neuron, or I don't know, those jobs. I can't even think about it. Like one of those positions where you have some executive at a firm somewhere, and there's a person that goes and gets them coffee in the newspaper or whatever. That's what the glial cells do. They help to provide sustenance and nourishment, all right, to the nervous tissue. All right, so a couple parts here of the neuron that you want to know. And we'll go into this in more detail in later chapters, but I just want to kind of throw this out here at you. You've got the cell body. All right, so if we look at our neuron, you've got a structure here, all right, and it looks kind of like this. It's a horrible drawing, I apologize. All right, and then you've got these projections that come off, these little processes. Those are called the dendrites. So the cell body is this kind of bulbous structure right here. That's where you're going to find the nucleus and all the organelles inside, all right, like the rough endoplasmic reticulum and whatnot. So you'll have these nerve processes that come off the cell body, and those are referred to as dendrites, okay? And their job is to receive incoming signals, but they'll at the same time, they'll also transmit information onto other neurons, okay? So those smaller processes are called dendrites. Then you're going to have one big process that comes off the neuron, and that's referred to as the axon, okay? And so when your neuron starts to generate a nerve signal, it's going to transmit it down the axon, okay? All right. So that's it for the tissue. All right, but I do want to just discuss a couple other I'm trying to think of a good word here to use. Concepts, all right, for chapter 5. So as we move on from tissues, now we're going to move up our organizational chart into organs, all right? So before I continue on, any questions so far? Okay, cool. All right. All right, well, in case there are any questions, to ask at any time. All right, so organs. So when we learned about tissue, tissues are going to be made up of similar cells, all right, that are going to perform a common function. Organs are going to be made up of 2 or more types of tissue, okay? So those functions that these tissues are going to perform are going to be much more complex, all right? But they're going to work together. So the example that we love to use for this class is the stomach, okay? Skin too is another one, but stomach is great because it has all 4 tissue types. And if we can recall about our 4 tissue types, all right, we have, all right, epithelial tissue in the stomach, okay? We have connective tissue in the stomach. We have muscle tissue, and we have nervous tissue. So we'll break it down here on this next slide, okay? So the stomach is lined by epithelium. And that epithelium, because remember, epithelium glands are made up of epithelium. Well, you have these glands in your stomach. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that you had your hand raised. The glands are going to secrete, for example, hydrochloric acid. Okay? And so these glands, all right, are going to fulfill the epithelium requirement here for chemical digestion because, of course, the stomach starts to break down some of the nutrients that you've ingested. Okay? Well, underneath the epithelium, you've got connective tissue. All right? So in our stomach, we've got areolar connective tissue. And because the stomach is an area or an organ in which there's absorption of materials, if we have areolar connective tissue, then we're going to have lots of blood vessels, which is important because as we start to digest certain products, we want to move that digested material, all right, from the stomach lumen into the blood vessels there. Okay? So this connective tissue not only helps with absorption, but it also helps to provide support and provide that stomach with the actual bean-shaped structure that it has. So of course, the stomach, and you'll learn more about this when you do the digestive tract, all right? But the stomach has smooth muscle involved because the stomach has to turn things around. You know, if you've ever seen a cement mixer truck drive down the street, it's got that big drum on the back and it's always moving. All right, part of it is it's always moving so the cement doesn't dry, but it's mixing the cement. Well, guess what? Your stomach does the same thing. All right, it's going to contract and relax. All right, it'll alternate the contractions and the the relaxations to help mix those materials inside the stomach. Okay, so you can maximize the amount of absorption. And then finally, the last tissue is the nervous tissue, okay? Because as you know, the nervous system is the control center for everything. So the nervous tissue is going to actually tell these muscles when to contract and when to relax. And it's also going to tell the glands in your stomach when to secrete, you know, the stomach acid and when not to secrete the stomach acid. All right, there's got to be an on and off switch for all this stuff, and that's where the nervous tissue comes into play. So it's important to understand that a lot of these organs, not all of them, but a lot of them will have all four tissue types. Your skin is another one. All right, your skin has two layers, the epidermis and the dermis. Well, the epidermis is made up of epithelial tissue. The dermis, all right, has connective tissue in it, has muscle tissue in it in the form of smooth muscle. When you get goosebumps, all right, that's because the smooth muscle in there contracts and causes the hair follicle to move. And then you also have nervous tissue in there, the receptors for if it's hot or cold or touch. All right, so you'll see that organs all over the place can have all four tissues, but they don't necessarily have to have all four tissue types. All right, you heard me talking about the different body membranes throughout our body, okay? And so one of the body membranes that we talked about were the serous membranes. All right, but understand that these body membranes are formed from an epithelial layer, okay? And then that epithelial layer sits right on top of connective tissue, okay? So we saw with the serous membranes how they line body cavities. They'll also cover viscera or organs of the body. And with our skin, we can see how it'll cover the external surface, okay? So the mucous membranes, we know where some of those are. All right, mucous membranes up in our nose, okay, parts of our throat, okay, or the pharynx. Serous membranes we talked about earlier on in the semester. They line the body cavities within our chest and our abdomen. All right, the cutaneous membrane is another name for your skin. And then in chapter 9, we'll talk about the synovial membrane. You'll see that in some of the joints of your body, like your knee joints or your knuckles. All right. So this diagram here shows you all the different areas in which you can see where we find all these different types of membranes there. All right, you're going to want to know, all right, we're drawing to the end here. We're getting close to being almost done. And I want to talk about tissue modification. There's some terms here that I feel like it's really important that you understand and know, all right, when we move here on out into this course. All right, the first term is hypertrophy. All right, and this, when we talk about tissue hypertrophy, what we're referring to is just the size of the existing cells. All right, we're not adding new cells. It's just the cells that are already there increase in size. So an example of tissue hypertrophy is muscle building. All right, bodybuilding. So when you look at some of these bodybuilders, and if they're drug-free, okay, I have to preface that with drug-free. They're not using steroids. All right. So when you go to the gym and you start to pump some iron, and when you walk out of the gym, you know, people will use the term like, "Oh, I'm swole, I'm swollen." Well, what they've engaged in is tissue hypertrophy, in which the size of those muscle cells have increased. They haven't increased the number of muscle cells; they've just increased in the size. So when we see an increase in size, then we refer to that as hypertrophy. When we see an increase in the number of cells, all right, an example of that would be when the uterus is growing, when a mother is pregnant, that is hyperplasia. All right. So an increase in the number of cells is hyperplasia. Hypertrophy is an increase in the size of the existing cells. Atrophy is when we see a shrinkage, all right, in both the cell size and the cell number or size. Okay, so a person that's lying in bed because they've been in a coma for a year and their muscles start to shrink down, right? We'll see that atrophy occur. If you've ever broken a leg, let's say, it happened to me when I was in 4th grade. I broke my leg sledding. They put a cast on my leg for 2 months. When I took the cast off, my left calf was half the size of my right calf. And that's because the muscles in that leg had atrophied. Okay, so that's why it's important for folks that are in a coma, let's say, they undergo physical therapy. They'll usually have an occupational therapist come in and move the person's limbs around so they don't exhibit a lot of atrophy. All right, metaplasia. This is important. When we're dealing with mature epithelium, it will turn from one form of epithelium to a different form. A lot of that has to do with adaptation, depending on what type of consequence or situation that epithelium is in. So the example here is with smokers. All right. If you remember, all right, the lining of your respiratory tract is mainly, at least in the upper respiratory tract, is pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. All right. But with smokers, as they start to smoke continuously, that epithelium will then transition into non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. And that's just a way that your body adapts to the harmful effects of the tobacco and the other toxic chemicals that are inside. All right. But once that person quits smoking, all right, they'll quickly revert back to the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. So you can see when it reverts, or not when it reverts, when it transitions from the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, it goes to the non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. That's a completely different type of epithelium. We lose the cilia, all right, and it goes from one cell shape to a completely different cell shape, columnar to squamous. All right, but again, it's a protective type of situation. We see the same thing in people that have GERD, all right, gastroesophageal reflux disease, all right, because all that acid keeps squirting up into the esophagus. The esophagus will transition, all right, into a different type of epithelium. All right, the next type of tissue modification is dysplasia. Now we're going to start to deal with, all right, some abnormal tissue. So often it's referred to as precancerous. All right, perfect example is when folks when I say folks, female patients go in for a pap smear and they get the results of the pap smear and it says that there was abnormal cells found. When they're talking about abnormal cells found, they're talking about dysplasia. All right, so they'll see, all right, and it's not uncommon. All right, I hate to tell you this, but when cells are constantly being sloughed off, all right, and being grown and regenerated, you will eventually get some sort of dysplasia that will occur. But in most situations, when that dysplasia occurs, all right, the body will find it and kill it off. Okay, so when we talk about cervical dysplasia, all right, when the female is exposed to HPV or human papillomavirus, all right, that virus can cause the growth of abnormal cells, and a lot of times those cells will be sloughed off or die off on their own. All right, this body will kill them off. All right, but if it's not, it can. I'm not saying it will, but it can transition into cancer or neoplasia. And what neoplasia is when we get this tissue that becomes out of control in growth, but it's an abnormal out of control growth. Okay, so neoplasia, new growth, all right, but it just grows at a much more rapid rate than normal. And so we start to develop this abnormal tissue. And there's two: benign, all right, which is going to be a less hostile type of tissue growth. It's localized, it won't spread. And then you got malignant. The malignant that's the bad one. That's the one we associate with cancer. And if something's malignant, it doesn't mean it will, but it can metastasize. And that means it'll spread and it'll invade other tissues. And there's different routes for the metastasis. I won't get into that. That's for a pathology course. All right. But when you get a malignant growth, it's pretty much cancer. And it doesn't always, but it can spread. Okay. And when it does that, it can interfere with that normal functioning. And if it's significant enough and it's on what tissue that it's interfering with its normal functioning, it can lead to death. Speaking of death, this term here, necrosis, refers to tissue death. All right? So this is what happens when we see irreversible tissue damage, for example, in frostbite. All right, if you are stranded somewhere like in the Andes Mountains or up there in the Alps for several nights and you are naked, let's say, and you don't have any way to warm yourself, all right, that the tissues will be in your fingertips if they're deprived from normal blood flow, because one of the reactions that your body is going to be to try to keep your internal organs warm. It'll decrease the flow of blood to your digits, to your fingers and toes. All right, if they don't get enough nutrients, then those tissues in those areas can die. Okay, and when they die, you start to get this inflammatory response. Okay, and gangrene is an example of that. So finally, with most of these chapters we're going to be going through, the latter portion of these chapters are going to talk to you about the effects of aging on whatever system that you're going to be studying. So this slide here, you're going to see, and all the things that are listed here, you're going to see that are going to be common types of issues that tissues are going to experience with the process of aging. Okay? So when we're younger, or if you are actually one of those people that actually is of the older persuasion like myself, but they like to try to take good care of themselves through proper nutrition, maybe exercise, all right, what will happen is you'll promote, all right, the results of exercise and good nutrition will help with normal circulation. Okay? Infrequent wounds, meaning you don't injure yourself quite a bit. So essentially what we're doing is we're trying to promote this normal functioning of these tissues. And as long as we're doing that, all right, we're going to see a pretty healthy result with the tissue as we age. Because remember, our tissues help with support, all right, maintenance of other tissues, all right, as cells get old or damaged, we replace those cells. All right, but as this occurs as we get older, these functions here slow down. And what will happen is that tissue will become altered. For example, the epithelial tissue thins out. And we see that in our skin. The skin of older folks is much thinner. So people that are in their 70s and 80s, you might notice they have more band-aids on their forearms for whatever reason. It's because the epidermis has become thinner and it becomes damaged more. All right, the connective tissue, all right, becomes less stretchy and less resilient to stretch, all right, because the connective tissue, some of the protein fibers like collagen, declines. You don't grow as much collagen, and collagen adds strength and stability to the connective tissue. Osteoporosis is more prevalent because bones become more brittle, because as collagen, and we'll learn in chapter 7, collagen makes up one of the organic components to bones. So as collagen declines, all right, the organic matrix to bones becomes less, so bones become more brittle. All right. Muscles and nervous tissue begin to atrophy because you're not as active. And even, I mean, roughly after the third decade of your life, so after your 30s, every decade after that, you lose about 10% of your muscle mass. All right? So all sorts of issues start to occur, okay? Usually our diets start to drop off. We just don't take as good care of ourselves. And some do. I'm not saying this happens to everybody, but some folks don't eat as well as they should. And that's why proper nutrition is of the utmost importance, and supplementation, is quite important. All right. And we're only as good as our circulatory system allows us to be. So if we're not able to get the nutrients and wastes circulated through our circulatory system for whatever reason, then we can start to compromise the peripheral tissues. All right, you guys, that is the end of this chapter, chapter 5. So you have been given all the review material for the first test. I am going to encourage you, make sure, all right, that you've been able to take notes on this assignment here. I will not be posting this review until after this assignment is due. All right. So that is because everybody was supposed to be present here, okay? So I hope you took good notes. Make sure that you are aware of what the assignment, the Blackboard Collaborate Assignment 1 requires you to do, okay? You need to do a write-up on this. If you're not sure, go to the assignment tabs in Blackboard and you'll click on the Blackboard assignments and it'll give you a description of the directions on what to do for this assignment, okay? And then I will, I think it's due tonight. Isn't it due tonight? The Blackboard, yes, okay, that's what I thought. Yeah, okay, all right. So then, yes, I will post this later on, all right, most likely tomorrow. Sorry, you guys, it's been a long weekend, all right. Like I said, for the Chapter 4, Part 2, Blackboard session, I had to record that twice because in my foolishness, I didn't have the audio on. And so it just recorded nothing for an hour and a half. Well, I recorded the slides and everything and me moving the cursor around, but there wasn't any audio to accompany it. Any questions about anything? You guys doing okay? All right, I just want to make sure, again, I know with the online learning, for some folks it's good and some folks it's not ideal, regardless. All right, but I'm here for you folks, okay? Good, I'm glad. Yeah, most people do say that the reviews have been very helpful, and that's my job. I mean, obviously, I want you all to succeed, and it's important to me. All right, that's why I do what I do. All right, well, if there's no questions, how many questions are going to be on the test? About 75. All right, the finals usually have 100. Okay, But for the lecture and lab, it's about 75. All right. Lecture is true, false, multiple choice. Lab is going to be mainly identification. There's a few multiple choice and true, false on those. Okay. You're very welcome. It's my pleasure. All right, y'all. I'll let you go. I know it's Sunday night. Yes, Monday through Thursday are the test dates. So what that means is you have those 2 tests that you need to take, both lecture and lab, and you have to complete both of the tests no later than 11:59 on Thursday night. So don't start either one of those tests on Thursday night at 11 o'clock unless you plan on being done with that test before 11:59. Because if you start the test and too late and you're not done with the test before 11:59, then it'll be late. Okay, and that's not good. I believe so. At least 75 questions. All right. I know for the lecture it's going to be at least 75 questions. Okay. Practice tests for the lab are under each chapter. If you go to the course content and then you go under the supplemental lab and lecture materials there, if you click on it, you'll go into that folder and it'll have mock exams for the labs. Okay, the mock exams they're not graded, all right, they're just practice. And if you decide to take it more than once, it'll be a different test. It randomizes the questions and sometimes it'll change the questions for you. So if you do well on those, you'll do well on the lab exam. There are no practice tests for the lecture exam. So I do strongly urge people to go in and try the mock exams. If you're pretty good with like the Quizlet material that I've been sending out, and you're pretty good with the spellings of the items, because it's not multiple choice. Excuse me, there's no test, there's no word bank. You've got to spell everything out, and spelling does count for the lab exams. Okay. Cool. I'm glad that you love Quizlet. Quizlet has been very helpful for a lot of students in the past. So I wish I had Quizlet when I was in college, when you guys, so I had something like that, but I didn't. But it's okay. I persevered. All right. Well, if there are no